The question of emotion is a key question in the philosophy of music. It's not the only question, but it's sort of the handle that pulls everything else with it. And the question is, what does it even mean in the first place for music to be emotional? There's a common sense way in which we all know that it's emotional because we feel it, and it's a direct experience and it's sort of self-evident. However, there are all kinds of ways in which that concept is indefensible and falls apart when you consider some of the related facts. And this is what has happened historically. There are two schools of thought that are the dominant answers to the question. One of them is formalism, which says this whole concept of music being emotional is kind of a quaint wives' tale that falls apart when you try to prove it or when you are subjected to logical scrutiny. And then answering the formalists comes the associationalist view, which says, oh yes, it does have emotion, and it has emotion because we hook music up with other things. And because it is piece reminds you of your Aunt Mildred, and you really love your Aunt Mildred, it's a loving piece, or this reminds you of the ocean, and therefore it's a piece that has feelings associated with the ocean. But of course then that falls apart also because how I feel about the ocean may be very different from how the next person feels about the ocean. I could be a sailor and I'm eager to go out for the next voyage, and the next person is terrified that a storm is going to come and wreck the crops. So these sorts of things vary from person to person. So these two existing historical viewpoints fall apart very quickly. And yet they've been the only two answers people have known. So you get this ping pong game where people say, well, it's pure form. No, it's not. It's associations. And then go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So, all right, come on here. Welcome, Luke. So how do we escape from that ping pong game requires reconceiving the whole subject. And my way of handling things is to consider the question introspectively. What do we even mean to say that music is an emotional experience? There's something in common between the musical experience and ordinary emotion. So what is it? If we know that by experience, then we should be able to look inward and sort it out and say what. And so the commonality that I'm identifying between the experience of ordinary emotion and the experience of musical emotion is what I call the psychological signature of the emotion. It's a motion of the mind with a distinctive set of quantitative characteristics. And this is the way in which I say music is mathematical and emotion is mathematical. So the psychological signature of each emotion has a distinct set of three characteristics. The characteristics are speed, intensity, and affect. So speed is pretty obvious. It's, your mind races if you're feeling anxious or eager. And that's in contrast to if you're feeling calm, relaxed. If you're going to sleep, the mind goes quite slow. And that's reflected in your blink rate. It's reflected in your rate of speech. It's reflected in your gesturing rate. So it's expressed physically as well. But we're talking about something internal. The second aspect is intensity, that there are strong emotions and weaker emotions or gentler emotions. Serenity is a gentle emotion, anger is a strong one, and so that's a second parameter by which emotions are distinguished. And third, the most complex by far, is the affective parameter. This is the higher order form of pleasure and pain, so that you have the bright emotions, that in some sense pleasurable emotions, joy, serenity, rapture, and you have also, contrasting with those, the darker emotions, melancholy, anger, anxiety, these sorts of emotions. And so if you put together these three characteristics, you have a distinctive signature for each of the emotions. So that joy is fast, medium to high intensity, and bright. Melancholy is slow, dark, and medium to low intensity. And each emotion can be defined accordingly. And that signature is the same in the experience of the normal emotion and the experience of the musical emotion. And so this is what unites the two. Now, of course, as you can probably tell, I'm setting aside the question of what your emotion is about, right? Because in ordinary life, if you feel joyous or proud that you got a promotion at work, the fact that it's a promotion at work and it's an accomplishment that you earned, that's part of the ordinary emotional experience, but that's something that does not factor into the musical experience. So that just needs to be set aside as not part of what unites the two in commonality. That's the foundational concept that I'm putting forth, and I build from there. And subsequently in the book I consider what does catharsis mean? It's quite an important historical and psychological concept, and I have a completely, you could say it's a completely new idea. I have a refined idea of what it is. I don't think catharsis means purging, which is what people normally think, that you have some kind of bad state inside which you fry out of yourself by experiencing it intensely. I don't think that makes sense. But we can go into that in the question period. And I also deal with what I call the hierarchy of emotion, which is the idea that there are feelings which are primitive or simple, basic level sensations, like the things that an earthworm would experience, a motion sensation or a satisfaction of hunger type of sensation. You move up from there by levels. And so you have, one of the very important levels is the mammal level, which introduces some very distinctive and important new kinds of emotions, because mammals have two kinds of feeling that the lower animals don't have, and that's playfulness and affection. Reptiles do not cuddle, and reptiles do not play, but dogs and bears do. So this is something that we have in common with the other animals, and is part of who we are, and what sets us above the reptile level. And so that's another layer. Above that, we have the distinctively human layer of emotions, which involves multifaceted emotions because we can respond to different aspects of the same thing. And then beyond that, what I call the level of moral, philosophical emotions. And these are emotions like self-esteem, self-actualization, triumph, exaltation. These are the top of the emotional hierarchy. And the nature of the emotional hierarchy is to use the top of the hierarchy to pull together all of the other levels that go with it. And this is my idea of what makes music good, that when music fulfills this process of catharsis and self-integration according to the hierarchy of emotion, that's good music. So that's my idea of the standard of what makes it good.
When you talk about emotion in music, are you talking about the emotions that the composer was trying to convey in his music, or the emotions that the listener feels?
So with the concept of the psychological signature, I'm identifying what I call the objective emotional content of the piece. It's the emotional content that is the same for everyone as a listener. And it's the emotional content that the composer, if he was a master, intended. However, it's possible for there to be a departure between what the composer intended and what he actually implemented. It could be ineptitude, it could be a vision that is smaller. Here's the thing that I learned as a composer. You put more into your music than you realize you are putting in, right? So there is conscious intention, but there's a lot more behind that as well. And the emotional content of the music is carrying all of that and needs to be unpacked. So I agree with what maybe I think you're suggesting, which is that the listener perspective is primary. Because if we didn't have the experience we have when we listen to music, we would not write it or perform it. However, there are also factors in listener experience that need to be separated out as individual variation, rather than the objective emotional content in the sense that it's the same content for everyone.
I think you called it a refinement of the concept of catharsis.
I introduced this in my book as the idea of emotional integrity, the process of emotional integration. In ancient traditions, this is simply called spiritual harmony, but it's not merely a state, it's a process. And it begins with some frame of mind, some state of mind that has incompleteness. It has conflict, mystery, an opposition of elements that needs to be reconciled, something that needs to be worked on, something that's not settled, not complete, not finished. And then it doesn't just pop resolve, there's a process of taking it apart and reconfiguring it, the emotional content, the emotional material. And then in the end, it is put back together again to resolve the conflict that had originally been there. This is what I call the symphonic process, because it's a progression that introduces material with some incompleteness or conflict, transforms it or develops it, and then puts it all back together again in the end in a way that settles that incompleteness. So this is what I mean by catharsis. This is the process of emotional integration by, in effect, analysis and synthesis, taking apart and putting together, which is very different from the idea that if you've got some let's say, pain or anger or bleeding heart pity that you want to purge, that you experience it very intensely to sort of fry it out of your system. I don't think there is such a thing, because even though in that moment you may burn off the emotional energy, it emblazons that as a character trait even more deeply into you. If you think, for instance, if a drug addict were trying to quit taking drugs, nobody would say, you just need to get really, really high. And that process of intensely experiencing the drug high will burn it out of your system, and then you won't be addicted anymore. It's just the opposite of that. There's a much more complex cognitive process that happens, that you understand, okay, what is it that I'm, like, if you're doing a drug addiction that you're avoiding your issues, you take that apart. So this gets to some of the interconnections of the musical process, relation to life process of emotion.
Can you go into more detail about how the settling of these incomplete emotions can make a musical piece either bad or good, objectively?
So there are two purposes of music, two conceptions of music that work in different directions, and I'm forming a theory of what I call the Apollonian purpose of music, the one that is expressing the nature of the god Apollo as a symbol, the god of reason, as contrasted with the god Dionysus. Dionysus wants to be liberated from the shackles of the higher cognitive powers and to release the wild animal from the oppressive force of intelligence. The Apollonian purpose of music is to become one being out of all the aspects and parts of your person, which include the different levels of humanity, and which includes the process over time, as I described, which is that catharsis, take apart and put together. So music that serves these needs is what I regard as good in the Apollonian sense.